Across the breadth of the galaxy, there are places where war never comes, and yet war is all that is prepared for. Sectors where the void lanes are empty of raiders, where the star forts hang silent, where planets live under an unchanging shadow of watchtowers that have not fired in centuries. To the Imperium, such places are rare blessings, oses in an age of fire. But blessings can be illusions, and peace can be a trap laid across millennia. It is in these spaces, these forgotten margins between the frontiers and the heart of Imperial might, that the Iron Sentinels stand. They are the wall where there is no siege, the sword that never strikes, the oath spoken into the silence. Their history is neither sung in the great cathedra of terror, nor etched into the high halls of the Adeptus Astartes. Yet if they were to fall, the collapse would be silent, until it was too late to reverse. The Imperium's endless wars are fought in burning cities and void-choked corridors, in the screaming debris fields of shattered planets. These places make heroes, forge martyrs, and provide the administratum with propaganda to keep the citizenry obedient. But the great machinery of the Imperium also depends on places where the front is not yet upon them, on fortress worlds that hold the line not through battle but through deterrence. The Iron Sentinels are such deterrents incarnate, living, breathing bulwarks whose mere presence renders invasion a fool's gamble, and because their duty is not to fight but to prevent the fight, their existence is shrouded in strategic silence. Origins are difficult to trace. The oldest sealed archives suggest the Sentinels' foundation may date to the late Great Crusade, in the decades before the Horus Heresy tore the galaxy apart. Back then, the legions Astartes swept across the stars like fire-given form, burning out resistance, enforcing imperial truth, and then moving on. But conquest was never enough. Worlds once pacified were left to stand on their own, their only protection local militias and planetary defense forces. Many of these worlds were reclaimed by rebellion, by alien incursion, or by the slow decay of imperial will. In certain critical sectors, rich in resources, placed along vital warp corridors, the Imperium could not afford to lose ground. It is believed that the earliest version of the Iron Sentinels was seeded in these places, a hybrid force combining Astartes' gene stock with advanced Mechanicus integration, garrisoned not for a campaign, but for eternity. They were never meant to roam the stars. Unlike other chapters whose fleets burn from one war zone to another, the Sentinels did not move. Once assigned to a bastion, their orders were simple and final, hold until relieved. In practice, relief almost never came. Decades passed into centuries. Castellans died at their posts, replaced by their successors. The fortress never abandoned, its databanks never wiped. In time, these bastions became more than garrisons. They became living ecosystems, sealed citadels where warriors, serfs, tech priests, and servitors existed in a self-contained rhythm of maintenance, patrol, and silent expectation. To understand the Iron Sentinels, one must understand the nature of their vigil. It is not the vigilance of a soldier on the front lines, whose every heartbeat is in the shadow of incoming fire. It is the vigilance of the prison guard on the night shift, the lighthouse keeper in calm seas, the hunter waiting seasons for prey that may never come. This is not lesser vigilance. It is harder. To remain sharp when nothing happens for generations demands a mind tempered into iron and a will unbent by tedium. The Sentinels are not warriors in the conventional sense. They are wardens of reality, and reality is a prison that must not be breached. The earliest chronicles describe their fortresses as half submerged into the ground, adamantium roots binding into the bedrock, plasma conduits humming in perpetual readiness. Orbital gun platforms hung overhead like steel constellations, linked by encrypted Auspex nets and automated targeting matrices. Subterranean hangars housed atmospheric interceptors that had not flown in decades, yet were kept at launch readiness with fuel cycles renewed every day without fail. No room in these bastions was ever unmonitored. No corridor went unpatrolled. The Sentinels measured time not in hours, but in readiness states. And yet, for all their discipline, they were ghosts within imperial bureaucracy. The Departamento Munitorum rarely named them in official reports, preferring euphemisms: Permanent Garrison Force 77 Theta, Custodial Legion Asset, Static Defense Node. Some speculate this was deliberate obfuscation. The Imperium thrives on visible symbols of power, and the Sentinels were intentionally hidden from public consciousness. Others suggest the truth was simpler. Those who served never left. and thus their stories never entered the wider record. Isolation forged them into something apart from other Imperial forces. While Codex-compliant Astartes chapters cycle through campaigns and recruitment worlds, the Sentinels drew their neophytes from the very planets they guarded. Children born in the shadow of the fortress dreamed not of travel among the stars, but of taking the oath of iron and standing their watch until death. Over generations, this created a strange kinship between fortress and populace. The Bastion was not an occupying force, but a hereditary protector, its warriors as much part of the planet as its mountains and oceans. In some cases, whole planetary cultures reoriented themselves around the fortress, timing festivals to its maintenance cycles, using its silhouette as the centre of their heraldry. The philosophy underpinning their service is simple to state and impossible to perfect. A wall unbreached is a war never fought. This maxim, etched into every bastion gate, was not metaphorical. For the Sentinels, the act of holding is not merely defensive, it is proactive survival. If the wall stands, the Imperium behind it stands. If the wall falls, the collapse spreads like a virus through the warp lanes, drawing enemy fleets and corruption deeper into Imperial territory. Their creed accepts no middle ground. There is only the wall intact or the wall fallen. But such clarity comes with a price. For the Sentinels, any failure is total. A single breach, no matter how swiftly repelled, is considered an eternal stain on the Bastion's honour. This belief has bred an almost pathological rigidity. In recorded history, there are incidents where Sentinels refuse to withdraw from an indefensible position, choosing instead to be entombed within their own fortress as its reactors went critical, rather than abandon it to the enemy. Imperial strategists call this stubbornness. The Sentinels call it fidelity. The galaxy turned, ages passed, and empires rose and fell in the spaces between their fortresses. They remained unchanged. During the Age of Apostasy, when the ecclesiarchy drowned entire sectors in blood and fire, many bastions sealed their gates and refused to participate in the wars of faith, focusing solely on the original mission: hold the wall. During the Macarian Crusade, while other chapters surged forward with the great conqueror, the Sentinels stayed in place, protecting his supply lines and staging worlds. When the Black Crusades erupted from the Eye of Terror, they did not move to Cadia's defence. They held their own sectors, believing that to abandon their post for even the most noble cause was dereliction. In this way, they earned both quiet respect and deep resentment. Imperial Guard commanders cursed their unwillingness to commit mobile forces to major offensives. Navy admirals valued their immovable strongholds as safe harbour in hostile systems. And among the Inquisition, opinions were divided. Some saw the Sentinels as incorruptible anchors in a galaxy adrift in heresy. Others suspected that such isolation could hide corruption too deep to detect. If there is a unifying truth in their legend, it is that they endure. Warp storms have cut off some bastions for centuries, yet when the storms break, the garrisons within are still at their posts, armour polished, weapons clean, watch rotations unbroken. There are fortress monasteries where duty rosters list the names of warriors dead for 300 years, the entries unaltered because the positions they filled have never been allowed to lapse. In one recorded case, a fortress on the edge of the Ghoul Stars responded to an Imperial hail after 712 years of silence. The voice on the Vox calm, formal, reporting no change in status. The great irony of the Iron Sentinels is that their existence is predicated on the threat of a war that may never come. Their vigilance is justified only if the enemy one day arrives. Until then, it is an investment that consumes lives and resources without apparent return. In the calculus of the administratum, such forces are difficult to prioritize. For the Sentinels, such thinking is blasphemy. Vigilance is not a resource to be spent. It is the foundation upon which the Imperium's survival rests. Without it, every victory is temporary, every peace a prelude to defeat. And yet, there are cracks in this iron creed, hairline fractures too fine to see until they spread. A warrior who spends his entire life waiting for an enemy that does not come may begin to imagine that enemy in the shifting of shadows, the creak of cooling metal. An officer who has never fired his fortress guns may begin to crave the proof that they work. Generations can pass without a shot fired in anger, and then, in a single heartbeat, the truth of all their readiness will be tested. It is said among the Sentinels that the watch ends only in death. But death comes in many forms, sudden and violent, slow and unseen, or hidden behind the certainty that the wall will always stand. The oldest among them know this. They know that the absence of battle is not the absence of danger. They know that the galaxy remembers its forgotten wars in strange and cruel ways, and they know that somewhere beyond the range of their auspex, an enemy might already be moving toward them. Patient, methodical, and waiting for the moment when vigilance falters. What does unbroken vigilance cost? When the enemy may never come. The Iron Sentinels were not born into glory. They were forged in places where glory could not survive. In the centuries following the Great Crusade, as the Imperium sought to consolidate the thousand worlds it had claimed, its attention was inevitably drawn to the most immediate threats, the worlds that burned, the war zones that bled. But a galaxy cannot be held only by its front lines. The arteries of the Imperium ran through quiet systems, and those arteries could be severed just as surely as any fortress wall could be breached. It was in those arteries, in the dim-lit sectors beyond the heroic maps of campaign chronicles, that the Sentinels were shaped. The initial deployments were haphazard, almost improvised. The Emperor's legions could not afford to keep entire companies anchored to static garrison duty, without stalling their momentum, so commanders began detaching elements, veteran squads, reserve companies, sometimes entire understrength formations, and leaving them to oversee compliance in key systems. These detachments were augmented by the Mechanicum, who saw opportunity in creating semi-autonomous defense nodes to protect their forges and resource worlds. Over time, these isolated elements began to develop shared protocols, rituals, and a culture distinct from both the legions they were drawn from, and the Mechanicus cohorts they served alongside. No singular founding marked their creation. Instead, the Iron Sentinels emerged like iron deposits forming deep within stone, slowly, under pressure, shaped by forces unseen. Their earliest fortress monasteries were often constructed atop ruins older than the Imperium itself, alien citadels, Xenos starholds, or pre-imperial human battlements. These were reforged into bastions of the Omnissiah and the Emperor both, their alien or ancient stone sheathed in ferrocrete, their strange angles masked beneath the stern geometry of imperial architecture. In the dim glow of their strategiums, the original walls still whispered of wars fought before the birth of Terra's great dream. The Sentinels' existence during those early millennia was one of relentless adaptation. A bastion's garrison might number a few hundred warriors, or several thousand, depending on the scale of the fortress and the system it guarded. Some garrisons found themselves under constant low-intensity pressure, repelling pirate raids, suppressing uprisings, deterring ambitious rogue traders. Others endured centuries of silence broken only by the slow grind of maintenance rituals. In both cases, the doctrine was the same. The fortress was never to be abandoned, never to be left unready, never to be treated as anything less than a critical node in the Imperium's lifeline. This constancy bred a kind of stubborn ingenuity. Cut off from regular resupply, many bastions became adept at self-manufacture, using what little industrial capacity they could develop to maintain armour, ammunition, and war machines. Sentinel artificers learned to make a bolter barrel last a century, to repurpose agricultural servitors into munitions loaders, to strip crashed voidcraft for the alloys needed to repair void shield emitters. These practices became part of their identity, a belief that every fortress must be a self-contained world, able to outlast isolation of any duration. It was not uncommon for a bastion to be cut off for decades by warp storms, only to return to Imperial contact with its garrison at full strength and its defences in better condition than when the storms began. As the millennia ground on, this persistence deepened into something more than mere practicality. The Sentinels began to regard their bastions not as assignments, but as sanctums. The walls were sacred, the armoury was a reliquary, the Vox Tower was a beacon of both faith and purpose. Warriors took vows not to the Imperium as an abstract, but to the fortress itself. The fortress was the embodiment of their oaths, the tangible form of their honour. To die defending it was not only duty, it was transcendence. In time, this reverence shaped their recruitment. While many early Sentinels were drawn from other Imperial forces, later generations were almost exclusively recruited from the worlds under Sentinel watch. Children raised in the shadow of a fortress grew up under its ceaseless vigilance, its silhouette etched into the horizon of their lives. Some saw the garrison only during the rare ceremonial displays when the gates opened to admit supplies or parade honor guards through the cities. Others lived within the fortress itself, children of serfs or attached mechanicus adepts, their earliest memories filled with the scent of machine oil and incense. For these children, joining the Sentinels was not a calling, it was the natural culmination of their lives. The oath they took was unlike any in the wider Imperium. Most Astartes swear service to their chapter and to the Emperor. The Iron Sentinels swore the Iron Oath, an unbroken chain of service to the fortress, the world, and the Emperor in that order. To them the Emperor's will was expressed through the fact that they had been placed here, and here they would remain until death or relief, and relief they understood almost never came. Such permanence shaped their warcraft. The Sentinels mastered siegecraft not merely from the perspective of the attacker or the defender, but from the standpoint of the eternal custodian. They learned every line of fire, every weakness in the walls, every pattern in the surrounding terrain. They knew where an enemy might land troops, how they might mass armour, how they might attempt to breach. They studied orbital vectors and gravitational wells, plotted firing arcs for guns that had not fired in centuries, and rehearsed evacuation routes that had never once been used. To outsiders, it was obsessive. To the Sentinels, it was breathing. This doctrine also bred a caution that bordered on paranoia. Every visitor to a bastion was catalogued, scanned, and assigned an escort. Supply convoys were inspected at 3 separate checkpoints before being allowed into the walls. Incoming Vox traffic was filtered through layered encryption and psychic wards. There were cases where Imperial envoys waited days outside the gates, while the garrison verified their credentials, even in times of peace. The fortress was more than a place. It was a membrane between safety and annihilation, and nothing was allowed to pass without scrutiny. Inevitably, this way of life placed the Sentinels at odds with other Imperial commands. Astra Militarum generals, tasked with rapid redeployment of forces, chafed at the Sentinels' immobility. Naval captains complained that Sentinel-controlled void lanes were bound by endless security checks and overcautious traffic control. Even the Inquisition found them difficult to deal with, as the Sentinels would sometimes refuse entry to even a rosette-bearing agent if the fortress commander deemed the visit insufficiently justified. Yet for all these frictions, the bastions were too valuable to dismantle. In a galaxy of shifting borders and sudden crises, the permanence of the Iron Sentinels was an asset no High Lord could deny. Over centuries, the Sentinels' culture ossified into tradition. Maintenance cycles became rituals, watch rotations were sanctified by chants, even the cleaning of weapons was done to the rhythm of liturgical recitation. Armour was polished not to gleam for ceremony, but to ensure no flaw in the ceramite could spread unnoticed. Servitors were programmed to patrol the same routes at the same times, their presence as much a reassurance as the walls themselves. In such an environment, change was viewed with suspicion. Even when the Mechanicus introduced new weapons or armour patterns, they were often adapted to fit the old forms, so that the fortress, and the warriors within, remained recognisably the same across the centuries. There were no banners of conquest to mark their achievements, no laurel-wreathed statues in distant capitals. The Sentinels marked time in decades without battle, and considered that the highest accolade. When their vigilance deterred invasion, there was no parade, no medal, only the quiet continuation of the watch, and when the rare siege came, it was met without surprise or panic. To the Sentinels, a siege was not a crisis. It was the moment they had been waiting for, the purpose for which they had been shaped. It is in this context that their true rise occurred. As the Imperium expanded and then contracted under the tides of war, the Sentinels' bastions became fixed points on the map, unchanging in a galaxy where little else could be trusted. Traders learned to use their systems as waypoints. Refugees from lost worlds found sanctuary behind their walls. Even rival Imperial commands grudgingly relied on Sentinel bastions as rally points in emergencies. The more chaotic the galaxy became, the more valuable the Sentinels' constancy was. And yet, this same constancy carried a shadow. A fortress that stands too long without being tested can become overconfident in its own invincibility. A warrior who trains for centuries without real combat may find that the first blow lands harder than expected. Among the oldest Castellans there were whispers, never recorded, never shared outside the command echelons, that a fortress could become a prison for the mind as much as a shield for the world. But such thoughts were not encouraged. The Iron Oath did not speak of doubt, it spoke only of endurance. Thus the Iron Sentinels continued century upon century, their name rarely spoken beyond the sectors they guarded, their deeds unrecorded in the great annals of Imperial glory. To the galaxy at large they were little more than a rumour, a story told by voidfarers of silent bastions that lit the void with their auspex arrays, watching, always watching. To those who lived under their shadow, they were an unshakable fact of life. To themselves, they were the wall. It would be easy to believe that such a life could last forever, that the silence beyond their walls was proof of their success. But the galaxy does not grant eternity. All walls are tested in time, and the Iron Sentinels, forged in obscurity, would one day learn that the shadows they had guarded against for millennia were not empty after all. The Iron Sentinels did not rise in splendour. They rose in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy humming quiet of distant engines, the stillness before orbital bombardment, the poised breath of an executioner. While other Imperial forces proclaimed their victories through banners and litanies, the Sentinels claimed theirs through the absence of opposition. Planets they touched did not erupt in war, they simply fell into still obedience, as if the mere presence of the Sentinels erased all possibility of defiance. Their earliest campaigns were waged not in the blazing theatres of the Segmentum Solar, but in the dim, neglected margins of the Imperium, sectors where the Adeptus Terra's writ had grown faint, where governors ruled as petty kings and chaos cults festered in forgotten manufactoria. It was here that the Iron Sentinels learned their art, war as deterrence, vigilance as occupation, annihilation as punctuation. They struck first at the Hellis Reach, a cluster of resource-rich worlds along a narrow but vital warp corridor. The Hellis governors had not tithed properly in 2 centuries. Arbit's detachments sent to enforce Imperial law vanished without trace. When the Sentinels translated into orbit, they did not announce themselves. Their strike cruisers and battle barges hung above the worlds like black iron moons, their vox channels locked to silence. The first governor to submit received no words of pardon, only a new set of regulations transmitted in binary code, and the arrival of a Sentinel garrison to ensure they were followed to the letter. Resistance was not crushed in battle, but erased through precision. The Sentinels did not waste shells on planetary bombardments. They targeted only what they deemed essential to break the will of defiance: command spires, orbital relays, and in one case, the personal gardens of a noble whose pride outweighed his sense. They waged war as a surgeon cuts, with economy, precision, and the coldness of inevitability. The effect was devastating. Within 3 standard weeks, Hellis Reach tithed again, and its leaders spoke of the Sentinels not as liberators nor conquerors, but as an inescapable truth, like gravity or the passage of time. From there, the chapter moved in calculated arcs along the fringes of Imperial control. Their librarians plotted routes not merely for conquest, but for the creation of strategic quiet zones, sectors in which the absence of threat was itself a weapon. Any system falling within these arcs was bound into the Sentinel's sphere of vigilance. Unlike the more ostentatious chapters, the Iron Sentinels made no effort to recruit glory seekers. Their aspirants were drawn from worlds already under Sentinel watch, chosen for their discipline, not their daring. In training, the neophytes learned that heroism was a liability, that victory was measured not in slain foes but in decades without rebellion. They learned to fight not to win glory but to ensure stability, a colder, harder purpose. Their fleet grew, not through constant resupply from the forges of Mars, but by reclaiming and refitting the derelicts of the Imperium's long wars. Old lunar-class cruisers, stripped of ornamentation and clad in austere grey, joined their convoys. Strike craft were overhauled with reinforced hulls, designed to endure decades of patrol duty without dock. Every hull bore the same mark, the Eye of Vigilance, a stylized iron iris that never closed. It was painted not in bright heraldic colour, but in dull black, so that it seemed less a sigil and more an absence, a hole through which something watched. Over the decades, the Sentinels established a doctrine that would define them, the Trium Code. This threefold law governed all their operations. First, never leave a threat to fester. Second, never allow a threat to rise again. Third, never permit the Imperium to forget it is watched. The Triumph Code was as much psychological warfare as military doctrine. Every occupied world received regular patrols, even if decades had passed without unrest. Every Sentinel garrison was rotated precisely on schedule, down to the hour, so that the people knew, not suspected, not feared, but knew, that they were being observed at all times. In this era, the Iron Sentinels' reputation began to precede them. Merchant captains spoke of systems where piracy had simply ceased, where the appearance of an unidentified ship was followed within days by the silent arrival of a grey-hulled Sentinel vessel. Rogue traders began to avoid their territories altogether, preferring to lose profit rather than risk the attention of the Watch. Even the Orcs, ever eager for battle, learned to skirt the fringes of Sentinel space. They found little joy in fighting an enemy that offered no grand melee, no roaring charge, only sudden death from distant guns, the precise dissection of their warbands before a wah could take root. But this efficiency came at a cost. In the wider Imperium, whispers grew. The Administratum praised the Sentinels' results, yet muttered about their autonomy. The Ecclesiarchy questioned their piety, for the Sentinels did not host grand sermons or allow missionary orders to meddle in their protectorates. To the Ministorum, a world that feared the Sentinels more than the Emperor himself was a world drifting toward heresy. To the Sentinels, such fears were irrelevant. Faith was not their duty, order was. Tensions first stirred in the Obrecht Spiral, a mining nexus that supplied adamantium to forge worlds across two sectors. When a new planetary governor attempted to alter tithe schedules without permission from Terra, the Sentinels responded before the Adeptus Arbits could even convene a tribunal. Their fleet appeared in synchronous orbit over all three of the spiral's primary worlds, disabling each governor's palace with precision lance strikes that destroyed only the upper spires. The governors were removed, their families exiled to barren moons, and replacements installed within days. The Arbits protested, but the Lords of Terror let the matter slide. Production in the spiral had never been higher. It was in the aftermath of Obrecht that the Sentinels began deploying silent bastions, immense void stations constructed at the edge of inhabited systems, armed heavily enough to repel cruiser groups, and garrisoned with enough astartes to end any rebellion before it began. These stations did not communicate unless required. They simply floated in the dark, their cyclopean eyes fixed inward. On more than one world, entire generations grew up under the shadow of a bastion, never once seeing its guns fire, yet never daring to forget they existed. With each expansion, the Sentinels' command structure adapted. Their chapter council, a small assembly of the most senior captains and the master of vigilance, became less concerned with individual battles and more with the maintenance of what they called the Iron Net, an interlocking lattice of controlled worlds, patrol routes, and surveillance posts. This net was designed so that no fleet, no crusade, no migration could pass through their domain unnoticed. Over time, their borders became less like lines on a map and more like the edges of a steel trap, invisible until it closed. And yet, even as they perfected their reach, subtle cracks formed. Some younger battle brothers questioned the endless cycle of watchfulness without war, wondering if the chapter was becoming more warden than warrior. Others, raised in the cold shadow of bastions, entered service with a quiet resentment toward the very people they protected. These were not mutinous thoughts, not yet. But they hinted at a shift in the chapter's soul, a slow drift from the fire of crusade toward the frost of custodianship. The Iron Sentinels did not notice, or chose not to. Their creed had no place for self-reflection. Their gaze was turned outward, ever outward, scanning the void for the next flicker of unrest. They believed themselves incorruptible, for vigilance was their armour, patience their shield. But vigilance can harden into isolation, and isolation can sharpen into something colder still. In the years to come, the galaxy would test whether the Sentinels' iron horizon could hold against the tide, for now they stood unbroken, their eyes fixed on the dark. And far beyond their borders, something in that darkness was already watching back. They say that walls are built not merely of stone or steel, but of the will that sustains them. For the Iron Sentinels, the bastions they raised during their 4th century of awakening were not fortifications in the mundane sense, but embodiments of their creed, silent declarations to friend and foe alike that they had come to endure, to watch, to hold. Across the dust-choked plains of Mirathis, the blackened ice shelves of Coryphae, and the orbital citadels above the storm world of Hesperian, their presence became unmistakable. It began as an architectural campaign, born from necessity. The Sentinels' campaigns in the Helix Reaches had revealed the vulnerability of relying on borrowed strongholds and transient way stations. Too often, their garrisons had been forced into retreat when supply chains collapsed or allies proved untrustworthy. The solution was as uncompromising as the chapter itself: permanent fortifications, constructed with their own labour, stocked with reserves to last decades, and manned by warriors trained to withstand both siege and solitude. The first of these, Bastion Kelidros, rose upon the flensed bedrock of a world long stripped of life by forgotten wars. Its walls were wrought from ferrocrete and adamantium lattice, their surfaces etched with the Sentinel's sigil, an unblinking eye encased in a cog of black iron. Each watchtower was topped by an auto-turret of archaic Mechanicus design, jury-rigged by the chapter's own tech marines to fire for days without resupply. Beneath the fortress stretched levels upon levels of storage vaults, armories, and barracks, all shielded by void-hardened bulkheads. The Iron Sentinels built as they fought, layer upon layer, redundancy upon redundancy, until no single breach could bring the whole low. Yet the bastions were more than safe havens. They were nerve centres from which the Sentinels could project power across contested regions. Patrols radiated out in precise concentric sweeps, their timing calculated so that no blind spot existed in a 200-kilometre radius. Vox beacons anchored in the surrounding terrain ensured that even in the teeth of warp storms, the chapter's orders could be relayed with minimal delay. Those who lived within the shadow of these strongholds, colonists, traders, even Imperial Guard regiments, began to speak of the Sentinels as the Iron Vigil, guardians who saw all and forgot nothing. But the truth was more complex. Every bastion was a prison as much as a sanctuary. The Sentinels' warriors stationed there lived under unyielding regimens. Shift rotations were calculated to the minute, sleep schedules enforced with the same severity as battle drills. Each evening, as the system's sun dipped beneath the horizon, the garrison assembled in the muster halls, where the chapter's canticles of vigilance were recited in a low, resonant chorus. The words were ancient, some traced back to the earliest days of the Great Crusade, an oath not of conquest but of ceaseless watching. The bastion-building campaign did not go unnoticed. Rogue traders complained that their shadowy routes were now under constant observation. Administratum envoys welcomed the increased stability, but fretted over the chapter's growing independence from central command structures. Most troubling to certain imperial governors was the fact that the Sentinels never relinquished a bastion once it was raised. Even on worlds that were not formally ceded to their stewardship, they claimed these sites were imperial assets held in trust, but the trust was theirs, not Terra's. In the years that followed, these bastions became staging grounds for operations far beyond their nominal sectors. When Orc warbands spilled from the asteroid clusters of the Mornax Belt, it was from Bastion Kelidros that the first strike teams launched, their Thunderhawks skimming the jagged surface of the planetoids before releasing drop pods into the greenskin heartlands. When a cult of the ruinous powers attempted to infiltrate the ice mining platforms of Coryphae, it was the garrison of Bastion Arestos who purged the corruption in a week of silent, methodical killings. Not a single bolter fired until the final day, when the cult's leaders were executed publicly before the survivors. Yet the greatest test came in the form of a Xenos threat, unlike the Orcs' bellowing brutality or the insidious whisper of chaos. In the void beyond Hesperian, the Sentinels detected movement, vast, heatless shapes drifting through the interstellar dark. At first, the chapter's augurs recorded only the faintest anomalies, dismissed by some as echoes of debris fields. But then came the disappearance of mining fleets, entire convoys erased without distress calls. Reconnaissance frigates dispatched from Bastion Ophrix returned, with their hulls scored by claws longer than a man's height. The Iron Sentinels had stumbled upon a Tyranid splinter fleet, small by the measure of Leviathan or Kraken, yet still large enough to strip the Hesperian system bare in weeks. In that moment, the philosophy of the Bastions was put to its harshest trial. For the Sentinels, retreat was unthinkable. The Bastions were not mobile, they were not meant to be abandoned. Instead, they became the bait in a calculated trap. The chapter fortified their positions even further, laying down kill zones, overlapping fields of fire, and corridors deliberately weakened to funnel the enemy into chosen kill sites. Supplies were sealed behind void shutters, outer settlements were evacuated and left as lure and delay. The Sentinels prepared to outlast the Tyranids, not outpace them. The battle that followed lasted 62 days. Wave after wave of chitinous horrors crashed against ferrocrete and steel, only to be broken by disciplined volleys and immovable lines. The Sentinels fought not for glory, but for endurance. The bastion's walls turned aside acid spit. Their gun emplacements tracked and shredded winged beasts before they could land. And yet the Tyranids learned, adapted, probed for weaknesses. By the 4th week, they began tunneling beneath the walls, forcing the Sentinels to wage a shadow war in the dark arteries beneath their own fortress. By the 8th, the biomass of the fallen had piled so high against the ramparts that the enemy could climb over their dead. Still, the Iron Sentinels did not break. When the last brood was purged, and the surviving bioships burned in low orbit, the bastion stood, blackened, pitted, but unfallen. The Hesperian campaign became a litany recited in every Sentinel muster thereafter. It was proof that their way of war could withstand even the horrors of the Great Devourer. But it was also a warning, for the Tyranids had not come in strength, and the chapter's victory had been bought at the cost of near exhaustion. Reserves depleted, armories stripped to bare shelves, the Sentinels had endured, but only barely. In the quiet aftermath as repairs began, the first whispers spread among the chapter's own ranks. What if the next enemy was greater? What if a foe came not in days, but in years, battering the bastions without pause? Could the Sentinels still hold to their creed? The question was not voiced in councils, but it was there, unblinking as the iron eye above each gate. For now they built anew. For now they watched. But even as the hammer rang on steel and the walls rose higher, a shadow passed across the long memory of the Iron Sentinels. The thought that vigilance, no matter how eternal, might one day face a storm it could not weather. And somewhere, far beyond their bastions, that storm had already begun to gather. There are many ways to understand the Iron Sentinels. Through the campaigns they have fought, the fortresses they have built, or the enemies they have annihilated. Yet all of these are only the surface. Beneath their deeds lies a core of iron-bound thought, a creed forged in the crucible of their earliest trials, and a structure of command and war-making unlike any other in the Imperium. To glimpse their heart is to understand why they endure, why they remain unbroken when other chapters falter, and why their enemies rarely see them coming until the killing blow has already been struck. The Iron Sentinels hold to what they call the doctrine of eternal vigilance, a belief that the galaxy itself conspires ceaselessly against mankind, and that only through tireless, unblinking watchfulness can humanity survive the long night to come. In their halls, this maxim is not simply an aphorism, but an operating principle burned into the mind of every aspirant from the moment he first kneels before the chapter's oathstone. It is a creed without softness, a faith in the inevitability of attack and betrayal. It breeds paranoia, but it is a paranoia weaponized, honed into readiness so sharp that a sentinel can act without hesitation the instant the shadow of threat is detected. Structurally, the Iron Sentinels adhere outwardly to the Codex Astartes, but internally their organization is a web of overlapping commands and contingency cells. Every company functions as an independent fortress, each captain fully capable of prosecuting an extended campaign without external resupply. More than this, every company maintains its own intelligence corps, mortal serfs trained to observe, record and relay threats without the knowledge of other companies. It is not mistrust that breeds this compartmentalization, but the belief that information itself is a weapon, and one that must be shielded from capture or corruption. Even their chapter master does not hold every piece of the puzzle at once, by deliberate design. The Sentinels' fortress monastery, Bastion Vigil, is an extension of this philosophy. Its outer walls are not ornamented with statuary or banners, but layered with arrays of auspex towers, gun emplacements, and shielded vox crypts. The very airspace is a kill zone, and the rockcrete foundations are hollowed with redundant armories and evacuation shafts. Every corridor can be sealed, every hall can be collapsed upon invaders. It is not built as a monument, it is built as a weapon. Their technology reflects this same pragmatism and guarded ingenuity. The Iron Sentinels maintain an unusually high proportion of ancient Mark power armor, particularly Mark III iron armor and reinforced Mark IV suits. These are painstakingly maintained by their tech marines, not merely for tradition, but for the superior durability in siege and boarding actions. Bolter patterns are often customized with reinforced magazines and redundant firing mechanisms. An enemy might jam one barrel, but never both. Perhaps most distinctive is their fleet doctrine. The chapter maintains a higher tonnage in Voidcraft than most Astartes forces of their size, favouring heavily armed strike cruisers modified for long-range sensor sweeps and extended patrols beyond Imperial borders. Where other chapters use their fleets for rapid deployment between war zones, the Iron Sentinels use theirs as a moving ring of steel, sweeping the void in vast arcs that often take them far from Imperial supply lines. Some have patrolled for decades without docking at an Imperial port, resupplying from captured enemy stockpiles or hidden caches seeded in unmarked systems. But the creed of the Sentinels is not only of steel and stone, it is of the mind. Their training regimes include not merely martial drills but constant mental war games, simulating infiltration scenarios, ambush conditions, and multi-front conflicts. Recruits are taught to assume they are always being watched, always being hunted, and to move, fight, and think accordingly. Even their initiation rites reflect this. A neophyte is not declared a full battle brother after a single trial of strength, but only after months of rotating guard watches in isolated stations, where the only contact is the whisper of the Vox and the distant blips of possible hostiles. Many are driven to the edge of madness. Those who endure emerge as warriors who do not sleep in the conventional sense, but exist in a state of permanent half-awareness. To the Iron Sentinels, this is not cruelty. It is mercy. For in their view, every world of the Imperium is but one moment away from invasion or rebellion, and the luxury of peace is a dangerous narcotic. They keep their minds sharp by denying themselves that luxury entirely. A sentinel on leave does not visit the pleasure spires of a hive city. He stations himself on its outskirts, studying the faces of its people, the angles of its roads, the subtle shifts in traffic patterns that might betray a brewing sedition. This mindset breeds a certain coldness in their dealings with others. Imperial Guard commanders sometimes resent their aloofness, their refusal to share full tactical plans, their habit of arriving without announcement and departing without farewell. In truth, the Sentinels consider such distance necessary. The fewer who know their movements, the harder it is for enemies to anticipate them. And make no mistake, the Iron Sentinels believe the Imperium is riddled with enemies already, within and without. Their philosophy towards the Xenos is utterly uncompromising. Orcs are to be eradicated root and branch, for their spores will always rise again if not burned from the soil. Eldar are to be treated as liars and manipulators, never trusted even when they seem to offer aid. And as for the Tyranids, the Sentinels see them not merely as an enemy, but as a looming inevitability, a tide that will eventually reach every corner of the galaxy. It is said that one of their reclusiarchs once declared, "To be vigilant is to prepare for the day when the sky itself falls and the earth screams." Their approach to chaos is perhaps the most telling. They do not simply fight demons and heretics. They quarantine entire sectors, destroy astropathic relays, and silence worlds rather than risk the spread of corruption. To some, this is seen as ruthless. To the Sentinels, it is the bare minimum. They believe that the true danger of chaos lies not in its open attacks, but in its insidious infiltration. It is for this reason that the Iron Sentinels rarely maintain close ties with other chapters. Bonds of brotherhood can be exploited just as easily as weaknesses in a wall, and yet for all their guardedness the Sentinels are not joyless automata. Within the sealed chambers of Bastion Vigil, away from the eyes of outsiders, there are moments when they speak openly of their fallen, of the battles that shaped them, of the rare victories that saved entire systems from oblivion. They honour these moments not with song or feasting, but with the lighting of the watchfire, a great flame that burns in the Hall of Eyes, fed with sacred oils and the ashes of ancient enemy banners. To a sentinel, standing watch beside this fire is the highest honour, for it is a reminder that every ember, every flicker is a life bought through vigilance. All of this, the fortress, the fleet, the creed, is bound together by their unyielding chain of command. While the chapter master holds supreme authority, his orders are carried out through the Triarch Council, 3 senior captains chosen not for their rank, but for their capacity to think as both warriors and watchers. Each Triarch oversees one aspect of the chapters being War, Watch, and Word. The Captain of War directs battle strategy and deployment. The Captain of Watch oversees intelligence, surveillance, and counter-infiltration. The Captain of Word manages communication, diplomacy, and the guarding of the chapter's oaths. No order leaves Bastion Vigil without passing through at least 2 of these Triarchs, a safeguard against rashness and against corruption. In this way, the Iron Sentinels are not simply a fighting force, they are a closed system, a self-sustaining engine of war and watchfulness, designed to operate even in the absence of Imperial support. This design has served them well for centuries, but it is also what will one day bring them into conflict with those who consider absolute autonomy a threat. For there are powers in the Imperium, High Lords, sector governors, even other chapters, who view such independence as dangerous, even heretical. And in the cold calculus of imperial politics, an Astartes force that answers only to itself is one step away from being declared renegade. And though the Iron Sentinels would never admit it aloud, they know this truth. They know that their vigilance might one day turn inward, that they might find themselves forced to watch the very Imperium they swore to defend. And in that possibility lies a question that will haunt them in the years to come. When the time comes to stand watch over the Emperor's realm, will they guard it from its enemies, or from itself? They said the Iron Sentinels could not be moved, that their citadels stood like frozen monoliths against the tides of history, their will unbending, their purpose immutable. For centuries it was true. The fortresses they had carved into the mountains of Dravak's Reach, the orbital bastions over Seraphin's Gate, the planetary defence grids of Kael Morn, all were built with the precision of eternity in mind. Each was a puzzle of ferrocrete, adamantine and gravitic anchor fields, designed to endure not merely decades but millennia. Yet in the long night of the 41st millennium there is no such thing as permanence. Even the hardest steel remembers the day it was ore. Even the strongest wall holds hairline fractures invisible to the eye. The first fractures in the Iron Sentinels were not structural but human, or perhaps post-human. Within their ranks, centuries of continuous vigil had forged a unity that seemed absolute, but absolute unity breeds the seeds of its own undoing. A cadre of veteran Castellans began to whisper questions in the deep command vaults, asking whether their eternal watch still served the Emperor's will, or merely preserved the pride of their own order. These murmurs, cautious and quiet, could have been smothered in their infancy, but the Iron Sentinels had long believed in disciplined self-regulation. It was a strength that now became a weakness. The fractures were allowed to widen under the guise of controlled discourse. Externally, the galaxy had shifted around them. The wars of the Segmentum Obscurus had grown bloodier, hungrier, and more desperate. The Great Rift's opening was still centuries away, but the warp storms had already begun to pulse with strange rhythms, as though some vast and unseen heart beat beyond the veil. Orc incursions swelled in the maelstrom shadow. The Drukhari, those predators of the webway, probed deeper into Imperial space with barbed hooks of malice. And in the quiet dark between stars, the Necron tomb worlds stirred in their slow, cold awakening. The Iron Sentinels' response was predictable. Tighten defences, double patrols, extend the scope of the Vigilant net, their pan-galactic listening array. But each expansion required resources, and each demand for resources brought them into sharper contact, and sharper conflict, with neighbouring Imperial authorities. Planetary governors, Mechanicus forge lords, and even certain rogue traders began to resent the Sentinels' growing requisitions. A fortress monastery might defend a world, but a fortress monastery also drained it. Tensions came to a head on Luthien Primaris, a fortress world whose tithe burden had become intolerable. The governor, emboldened by quiet support from the Segmentum Command, resisted the latest requisition of Prometheum reserves. The Iron Sentinels dispatched a single ship, the Presidium Invictus, bearing Castellan Marshal Veyron himself. No words from that meeting were ever recorded, but the outcome was plain. Luthien Primaris acquiesced, its reserves transferred, its governor replaced by an Imperial appointee. The fortress world's manufactoria laboured on, but a bitterness had been sown in the surrounding systems. whispers spread that the Sentinels were not guardians, but jailers. Inside their ranks, a more insidious corrosion took hold. The Iron Sentinels had always trained their initiates to think in centuries, to see themselves as threads in a tapestry too vast for individual ambition to unravel. But a new generation, forged in an era of ceaseless minor conflicts rather than grand crusades, began to chafe under the weight of endless vigilance without glory. Patrols that once were considered sacred duties became resented as rote obligations. Astartes who had never set foot on Terra nor fought in a full-scale planetary liberation began to wonder if their skills were being wasted on sieges that never came. Veyron, perceptive though he was, believed the solution lay in tightening doctrine rather than loosening it. He instituted the Edicts of Immutable Steel, a series of unyielding codes that forbade deviation from prescribed patrol schedules, denied the possibility of negotiated truces with any Xenos force, and mandated that no fortress under Sentinel control could be abandoned under any circumstances. These measures were meant to purify purpose. Instead, they calcified discontent. It was during this period that the Carthane incursion struck. The Carthane were a bizarre splinter culture of humanity warped by millennia of isolation near the Eye of Terror, their physiology altered by generations of exposure to thin warp radiation. They emerged suddenly, striking at the unfortified moons of the Garrus Belt, raiding for technology and captives. The Iron Sentinels responded with customary swiftness, deploying siegebreaker squads to reclaim the moons, but the Carthane did not fight for territory, they fought for disruption. Every Sentinel response left another flank exposed. Every recovered moon cost disproportionate resources. For the first time in centuries, the Iron Sentinels were forced into a defensive war fought not on the grand scale of planetary sieges, but in the endless whack-a-mole rhythm of asymmetrical raiding. This was not their doctrine. This was not their way. And it showed. The Carthane conflict dragged on for 12 solar years, draining morale and material alike. When it ended, it did so not with a decisive Sentinel victory, but with the Carthane vanishing back into the warp's shadow, their aims largely fulfilled. The Iron Sentinels had bled, not catastrophically but perceptibly, and perception was everything. The fortress monastery on Dryvak's Reach remained unbreached, but the galaxy had seen that the eternal wall could be worn down, grain by grain, raid by raid. Veyron did not live to see the next great challenge. He fell to a plasma lance while boarding a Carthane flagship, his armour split, his body cast into the void. His death was recorded in the annals with solemn brevity, but in the vaults beneath the monastery a more troubling note was added to the private archives, that Veyron's death had not united the Sentinels in grief, but deepened the quiet factional lines that had been forming for decades. The question was no longer whether the Iron Sentinels could endure an assault from without. The question, whispered in watchrooms and in the shadows of the training cages, was whether they could endure themselves. And even as the echoes of the Carthane War faded, a new and darker rumour spread among the distant outposts, that in the far eastern fringe something vast and chitinous had begun to blot out the stars. The Iron Sentinels dismissed these tales as voidfarer superstition, but they would learn, in time, that superstition often has teeth. The longest nights are those where the stars vanish, and the dark is so absolute it seems to seep into the bones of the universe itself. For the Iron Sentinels, that darkness came not merely from the void between worlds, but from within the fortress of their own making, a vigil shattered, a creed tested beyond endurance. In the years following the Carthane incursion, rumours whispered in the void bloomed into undeniable terror. The threat that had lurked in the eastern fringe, the encroaching Tyrannid swarm, was no longer a shadowy myth, but a ravenous storm bearing down on their borders. The swarm, vast beyond reckoning, did not care for honour, for tactics, or for the measured pace of the Sentinel's watch. It was a living tempest, a maelstrom of claw and carapace, erasing systems with a merciless appetite. The Iron Sentinels responded with the cold precision born of centuries. Bastions along the outermost systems were reinforced. Patrols were extended to their breaking points. The Triarch Council convened in unbroken session within Bastion Vigil, their deliberations echoing beneath vaults designed to withstand both assault and betrayal. Yet the swarm was relentless. Its tendrils slipped through gaps in the vigilance net, overwhelming outpost that had stood unchallenged for generations. In this crucible, the cracks within the chapter widened. The younger generation, already weary from decades of ceaseless watch, pushed against the rigidity of tradition. They sought more aggressive tactics, preemptive strikes, deeper incursions into swarm territory, hoping to disrupt the hive mind rather than merely survive its onslaught. The older Castellans, guardians of the Trium Code, decried such recklessness, clinging to the Creed's principle that every threat must be eradicated with deliberate precision. This ideological fracture birthed the Sentinels' first civil schism. It was not marked by open conflict, but by icy silences, by withheld support, by fractured commands in the field. In one pivotal campaign on the mining world of Raxus 9, a junior captain ignored orders to hold defensive lines and instead led an unauthorized strike deep into the swarm's lair. The assault destroyed vast Tyranid broodlings, but at the cost of vital supply depots. The campaign's success was Pyrrhic. The weakened supply lines precipitated the fall of adjacent Sentinel garrisons. Such contradictions gnawed at the chapter's foundation. The Triarch Council's authority was challenged openly for the first time in centuries. The Captain of War, a stalwart named Maldrath, demanded that the Captain of Watch cease his excessive surveillance protocols that drained resources and morale. The Captain of Word warned against fracturing the chapter's unity, but even his voice trembled beneath the weight of uncertainty. Amid this turmoil, the Tyranid swarm delivered its most devastating blow. The system of Calpharan, a linchpin in the iron net, was besieged and overrun after a protracted siege. The bastion there, once a beacon of unassailable strength, was reduced to ruin. Survivors told tales of horrific infiltration. Genestealer cults had undermined defences from within, while bioforms breached gates once thought impregnable. The fall sent shockwaves through the chapter and across the wider Imperium, yet even in defeat the Iron Sentinels found cause for reflection. Their doctrine, their very creed, had left them ill-prepared for a foe that did not abide by the rules of war, that struck not with honour, but with overwhelming entropy. The battle for Calpharan marked the end of the chapter's unyielding adherence to the Trium Code as it had been known. Reform was inevitable. The Council decreed the integration of new tactics, faster mobilization, acceptance of more flexible command structures, and unprecedented cooperation with other Imperial forces. It was a bitter pill, one that many within the chapter swallowed reluctantly, their pride bruised but their resolve hardened. But no change came without cost. The schism that had been simmering now erupted into open confrontation. Factions formed around divergent philosophies, the immutable watch, guardians of the old ways and the adaptive shield, proponents of evolution and flexibility. Battles fought in the shadows, contests of influence within Bastion Vigil, tested the bonds of brotherhood forged over centuries. In the end, the Iron Sentinels emerged fractured but not broken. Their vigilance was no longer eternal in its rigidity, but reborn through adaptation. The cost was high. Their bastions bore scars deeper than physical wounds. Their unity, once monolithic, was now a fragile mosaic. As the Tyranid swarm continued its inexorable advance, the Iron Sentinels' eyes remained fixed on the horizon, not as unyielding sentinels of old, but as warriors tempered by loss and change. And in that tempered vigilance there lay hope, fragile, flickering, but unextinguished. The galaxy's darkness does not merely fall, it seeps, it corrodes, it reshapes all it touches. For the Iron Sentinels, the aftermath of Calpharan was but the opening of a darker chapter. The fractures within their ranks, once whispered and hidden, now became wide chasms through which doubt, suspicion and despair flowed freely. The very fabric of their creed was tested against an unforgiving reality. That eternal vigilance demanded not only watchfulness of the enemy, but of one's own shadow. The adaptive shield faction, emboldened by their recent reforms and successes in flexible tactics, sought greater integration with external Imperial forces. They advocated for alliances, shared intelligence, and the pooling of resources with Mechanicus Forge Worlds and local Imperial Guard regiments. To them, isolation bred stagnation, and the galaxy's threats required unity beyond the chapter's walls. Yet, the immutable watch resisted with cold fervour. To their eyes, such alliances risked contamination, both spiritual and strategic. Every external hand extended was a potential chain that might bind the chapter's autonomy. To trust others was to risk betrayal. To share knowledge was to invite corruption. They argued that the Iron Sentinels had survived precisely because they answered only to their own creed, not to the fickle tides of imperial politics. The conflict was not merely philosophical but practical. The newly forged alliances led to joint campaigns against Xenos incursions and chaos cults. In the fields of Vraxus, Iron Sentinel squads fought alongside disciplined, Imperial Guard lines and Mechanicus servitors to purge a Drukhari raiding force that sought to rip open a warp rift. The campaign's success was undeniable, but so too was the tension between command structures. Orders were questioned, supplies contested, and rivalries flared beneath the surface. Within the chapter, clandestine confrontations grew sharper. The Immutable Watch accused their brethren of heresy, for fraternizing with Xenos-tainted forces and suspected infiltration by Chaos sympathizers disguised as allies. The Adaptive Shield viewed these accusations as relics of paranoia that would doom them all. Espionage, sabotage, and near-fatal duels erupted behind the walls of Bastion Vigil, each a silent battle as deadly as any fought on the field. Amid this turmoil, the Tyrannid threat evolved. The swarm that had overrun Calpheron returned, not as a chaotic horde, but as a precise and terrifying force, coordinated, adaptive, and driven by an intelligence that surpassed mere instinct. The Iron Sentinels' scouts reported new bioforms, synapse creatures with tactical awareness, biomorphs capable of manipulating terrain and disrupting communications. Each encounter forced the chapter to relearn hard lessons of humility in the face of an enemy that was not merely a predator, but a force of nature itself. The campaign to reclaim the shattered sectors of the Eastern Fringe became a crucible in the truest sense. Battles were fought in underground warrens beneath shattered moons, in ruined hive cities suffocated by fungal growth, and aboard derelict starships turned into living tombs. The Iron Sentinels pushed themselves to the brink, their bolters blazing, their chainswords singing the dirge of war. Yet each victory was hard won and exacted a terrible toll. The toll extended beyond flesh and metal. The chapter's Librarius, once a silent adjunct to the martial order, found its role magnified as psychic warfare surged. Sorcerous spores, warp-tainted biomorphs, and corrupting contagions tested their mental fortitude. The librarians battled not only the enemies of the flesh, but the shadows within their own minds. It was a war of perception as much as firepower, a war that deepened the fractures in the chapter's soul. As the Sentinels fought, the schism that had fractured their command became a ghost, haunting every campaign. Each company commander had to choose sides or forge uneasy alliances. The lines of loyalty blurred with pragmatism, and old comrades found themselves on opposing sides of silent wars. This internal discord played into the hands of their enemies, who sensed the weakening of a once impregnable fortress of resolve. In the midst of this darkness, a turning point emerged in the figure of Captain Thane Drekos. Once a fierce proponent of the Immutable Watch, Drekos began to question the cost of rigid doctrine when faced with annihilation. His pivotal intervention during the siege of Drexus Prime, where he led a desperate breakout that saved hundreds of Sentinel and Imperial Guard survivors, earned him grudging respect across factional lines. Drekos embodied the possibility of unity, a beacon amid the gathering storm. Yet even as hope flickered, a deeper shadow loomed. Reports from the void hinted at the stirring of Necron tomb worlds, ancient lords awakening from eons of sleep, their motives inscrutable and their technologies devastating. The Iron Sentinels, their eyes still fixed on the Tyrannid menace, had little time to prepare for a war that would test not just their strength, but the very essence of their existence. The crucible of shadows had tempered them, but it had also revealed their vulnerabilities. In a universe where the only certainty was death and decay, the Iron Sentinels were learning that vigilance alone was not enough. To survive, they must change. To endure, they must embrace the shadows within themselves and beyond their walls. And so the chapter stood on the brink, its creed fractured, its enemies multiplying, its fate uncertain. The Eternal Watch continued, but the Iron Sentinels were no longer the immutable bastion they once believed themselves to be. The twilight is not a moment of peace. It is the slow bleeding of light into shadow, the harbinger of endings and beginnings entwined. For the Iron Sentinels, this twilight descended with relentless inevitability, an inexorable force that tested their creed, their bonds, and their very souls. After decades of strife, internal fractures, and Relentless Wars, the chapter faced a threat unlike any before. A coordinated, multi-vector assault by the combined forces of Tyranid brood swarms and the awakening Necron dynasties. The Eastern Fringe, once a contested buffer, became the crucible where fate would be decided. The Necron awakened with a cold, mechanical precision. Their tomb worlds, long dormant, erupted with cataclysmic force, legions of undying warriors clad in living metal, their gorse flayers reducing entire battalions to ash in seconds. Their motives were inscrutable, their tactics unyielding. Unlike the chaotic fury of the Tyranids, the Necrons moved with calculated inevitability, reclaiming what they considered their ancient dominion. The Iron Sentinels found themselves caught between these two inexorable forces, each demanding a different response. Against the Tyranids, their traditional doctrine of relentless defense and attrition was tested beyond limit. Against the Necrons, the cold calculus of survival required swift, decisive strikes to prevent planetary reclamation. The chapter's bastions, once symbols of eternal vigilance, became battlefields of unprecedented ferocity. Bastion Vigil itself was besieged for weeks, its walls battered by ceaseless bombardment and infiltration attempts. The Triarch Council, fractured but resolute, coordinated defences, balancing the desperate need for unity against the stubborn pride of centuries. Among the darkest hours was the Battle of Celestine's Hold, a fortress monastery on the edge of the Dravak system. The battle was a maelstrom of fire and shadow, where bolters roared alongside the eerie hum of Necron technology, and Tyranid beasts tore through corridors once thought secure. Captain Thane Dracos led a counterattack that turned the tide, but at terrible cost. Nearly half the garrison was lost, and Dracos himself was grievously wounded. In the wake of these losses, the Triarch Council convened a somber conclave. The chapter faced an impossible choice: either retreat and risk losing centuries of vigil, or hold their ground and sacrifice everything. The decision was unanimous. The Iron Sentinels would stand even if their bastions fell. Yet as the war raged, a deeper, more insidious enemy took root. The internal schism, once an academic divide, erupted into open conflict. Factions fought not only on the battlefield, but within the command structures. Accusations of treachery, sabotage, and heresy tore at the chapter's cohesion. The immutable doctrine clashed violently with the need for adaptation. In a tragic irony, the very creed that had preserved the Iron Sentinels for centuries now threatened to undo them. The belief in eternal vigilance had bred inflexibility, and that rigidity was exploited by enemies and allies alike. Trust, the most precious currency of war, was in dangerously short supply. As the siege of Bastion Vigil reached its climax, a sudden and devastating betrayal shattered the chapter's final defences. An infiltrator, a zealot of the Dark Mechanicum, long hidden within the chapter's ranks, unleashed a viral contagion that crippled the fortress's life support and communications. The battle turned desperate, a desperate fight in the choking darkness for every corridor and gun emplacement. But even as Bastion Vigil fell, the Iron Sentinels fought on. Captain Dracos, rallying the shattered survivors, led a final assault that purged the traitor and sealed the breach. The cost was grievous. The chapter's once mighty bastion was left a ruin, its watch reduced to a shattered remnant. In the cold aftermath, the Iron Sentinels faced a reckoning. Their creed, their bonds, and their purpose had been tested in the crucible of twilight, and while they endured, they were irrevocably changed. No longer could they cling to the illusions of eternal strength or immutable doctrine. Their future lay in a new balance, between vigilance and adaptability, between unity and independence, between steel and shadow. The Twilight of Steel was not an end, but a beginning, a harsh, bitter dawn for a chapter that had long guarded the Imperium's edge. And as the shattered remnants of the Iron Sentinels gathered beneath the flickering watchfire, one truth was clear: the watch must go on. From the ruin of Bastion Vigil rose a silence that spoke louder than any bolter salvo. The Iron Sentinels, once the unyielding guardians of Imperial space, now found themselves a fractured shadow of their former selves, survivors of a war that had reshaped their destiny. The ashes of their vigilance settled across scarred worlds and shattered battlegrounds, a testament to both their endurance and their profound cost. The aftermath of the Twilight of Steel was a landscape of difficult reckonings. The chapter's remnants regrouped on scattered strongholds, each a fragment of what had once been a monumental fortress of war and watchfulness. Communication lines were tenuous, command fractured. The once cohesive Triarch Council was reduced to a semblance of its former self, its authority challenged by the rise of new leaders, who forged their own paths from the ashes. Imperial authorities, both local and sector-wide, watched with wary eyes. Some heralded the Iron Sentinels' survival as proof of their indomitable spirit. Others whispered fears of their autonomy, slipping beyond the Emperor's will. Rumours of internal discord and the dark Mechanicum betrayal spread like wildfire, casting long shadows on the chapter's reputation. The delicate balance between reverence and suspicion would shape their future relations with the wider Imperium. Yet amidst this uncertainty, the Iron Sentinels found new purpose. The war had taught them harsh lessons. Vigilance alone was not enough. Adaptability was survival. New doctrines emerged, blending tradition with innovation. The adaptive Shield faction, once marginalized, now guided the chapter's rebirth, fostering closer ties with allied Imperial forces and embracing flexible warfare that could respond to the galaxy's ever-shifting threats. Memorials rose where bastions had fallen, and the watchfire burned brighter in remembrance of the dead. The Hall of Eyes, once a solemn chamber of silent vigil, became a sanctuary of shared memory, a place where warriors recounted the horrors and triumphs of their ordeal, binding the chapter's shattered spirit in collective resolve. But even as they rebuilt, questions lingered like ghosts. How far could the chapter change before it lost its soul? Would the sacrifices of the Twilight of Steel be enough to secure their future, or merely delay an inevitable decline? And perhaps most hauntingly, if eternal vigilance was their creed, what did it mean when the Watchmen themselves became vulnerable to shadow? The legacy of the Iron Sentinels was no longer one of invincible strength, but of relentless endurance, a testament to the will to persevere against overwhelming odds, even when the cost was near annihilation. Their story became a cautionary legend whispered among other chapters and Imperial leaders, a reminder that even the mightiest bastions can fall, and that survival demands both steel and shadow. As the chapter turned its eyes toward the future, the spectre of new threats loomed on the horizon. The Tyranids regrouped, the Necrons slumbered but stirred, and the ever-present dangers of chaos lurked in the warp's dark tide. The Iron Sentinels knew their vigilance would never end. It could only evolve. In the quiet moments between wars, beneath the watchful gaze of the Watchfire's flickering flame, the Iron Sentinels whispered their solemn vow once more. A vow not just to guard the Emperor's realms, but to guard the fragile flame of their own survival. The Eternal Watch continues, not as an unbreakable fortress, but as a beacon flickering defiantly against the encroaching dark. The ashes of vigilance are not the end, they are the crucible from which a new sentinel will rise.